I believe we can have healthy rivers and a healthy economy. And one of the big pieces that I just frankly see differently than my friends that feel like breaching is the answer. I work in a biological system. We as humans want to say, if I do A, B will happen. And that's simply not the reality in a biological system.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. If you are a regular listener of the podcast, you've heard a lot of talk about the energy side of our work. 5 episodes worth of talk, to be exact. Today, we're going to explore something else near and dear to our hearts, and that's agriculture. Now, what exactly do dams and agriculture have to do with each other, you might ask? To help answer that question, our guest today is none other than Blaine Meek of Agri Northwest. So, Blaine, to lay the foundation for today's discussion, what is Agri Northwest and what's your role there?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. I appreciate the opportunity. We're a large farm. Uh, the reason that I get involved and that we've got to know each other is we pump water from behind our Ice Harbor Dam on the Snake River on part of our farm, and I've been asked in different ways and got involved in the Snake River issues. And so I like to say I'm trying to represent myself and my neighbors that are part of the 50,000 irrigated acres behind Ice Harbor Dam. My background, I grew up on a family farm in southern Idaho. Um, I have my claim to fame is Napoleon Dynamite, and I went to the same high school. That's where I grew up, farming with my dad, and then got the opportunity. A reality of family farms. There was my dad was farming with his brother, but there was 15 direct heirs between those our two families, and so if I wanted to keep farming, I had to find another way to do it. And so thankfully, I was able to find an opportunity to do that with Agri Northwest here in the Columbia Basin. And so we aren't a family farm, but I do like to make sure everybody realizes we are a farm of families that live the agriculture lifestyle and love our land and love the way we're able to live and work the ground.
So, it's fair to say that you have a sort of a not just a career in agriculture, but a life in agriculture. And, with that, I'm sure that you've experienced and learned a lot of interesting things along the way. Do you have any interesting insights or experiences that you could share just kind of to start things off and maybe some of the more, unique aspects of having a life in agriculture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to think about. I I definitely try to make sure people understand those of us in agriculture, it is a lifestyle. For a lot of this, a lot of our hobbies are tied up in our job, which on the one hand is great. Not everybody gets to do their hobby and get paid for it, but in a lot of aspects of my job, I believe that's the case. And and then it's just a tie to the land, to being outside, to um, trying to work with Mother Nature uh, in a way, and getting humbled that you don't have control of a lot of things, and but yet you're trying to do your best to control things. And so um, maybe the biggest thing I like to think about and that matters, at the end of the day, as farmers, we have to work with Mother Nature and the resources we have a crop to sell. And it's pretty cool, and I will fully admit to taking great pride into growing food and to be, when my crop is done and it's thinking about this is going to somebody's plate, this is going to a restaurant, this is going to be things people eat, and obviously that's important to all of us.
Definitely. And it, sometimes maybe I think that people who aren't familiar with agriculture, maybe they've even never had a garden or anything at the very least to sort of experience that on some level, they might get this, sort of misconstrued idea that somehow nature and agriculture aren't in unison at all times. And, as I hear you describing it's definitely not the case, right?
Yeah, and in our world today, in popular media, a lot of times, people for with different motivations try to scare us about what people are trying to do to our food. Like there's a boogeyman that's wanting to harm us in some way, and I always, I bristle at that on the one hand because it's kind of offensive in some terms, but those of us in agriculture, with rare exception, you can always find somebody who's doing something wrong, but with rare exception, um, I want my farm to be producing today, tomorrow, 100 years from now. And so, um, when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about environmental stewardship, uh, show me a farmer who doesn't care about those things, and they're not going to be a farmer very long, because that is what we have to do. This land that we have to work with, um, it, is we got to come back to it every year, and ask it to do its work again.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that obviously is a huge component of the work. For Agri Northwest, you guys serve Southwest Washington, and as you described it, it's a farm of families. So maybe help me understand a little bit more what that community looks like. What who are the families that make that up?
Oh, that's a great question. I obviously there's a lot of us, and so my first inclination is wanting to tell you about individuals, right? But that probably doesn't work, and you don't have enough time for me to go through all the names. And so, um, many of us are similar to me. We grew up on family farms that didn't have room for us to stay there, and so we've found a job in agriculture, and are able to keep farming that way. Many of us, um, we have a large Hispanic workforce. Um, I go from people who are recently come to the United States to employees that have been with us for over 40 years and have raised their families on the farm, and their kids are coming back and working. One of my favorite stories to tell people is, one of our great long-term employees, name's Diego. Um, he's been with the farm. He came as a young man, just recently came from Mexico. Was moving hand lines on the farm, was his first job, and he, in his time with us, which is 43 years now, he's went from that and worked his way up through the ranks, and got married and had a family, and is now one of our farm managers. And his son just graduated from Washington State University with his master's degree in agronomy, which is cool, and now works for Lamb Weston, the potato processor that buys most of our potatoes. And so, that's the kind of thing that is not uncommon, where like I allude back to, it's a lifestyle. We kind of have it in our blood, and what who we are is definitely affected by what we do.
That's a great story. That's a really cool one. Um, and I think it's also important to touch on just sheerly the importance of agriculture, not only to those communities, to the people that you're directly involved with, but um, whether it be Washington as a whole, or Southwest Washington, Washington as a whole, the Northwest, and even beyond. I mean, um, just the potato crop you mentioned, for example, that goes out to a significant number of people, and it's no small number of crops.
Yeah,
And
Austin,
yeah,
one thing that I like to make sure I tell people, because if you're not in agriculture, many don't realize it. The Columbia Basin is an amazing region in the world for farming. I've had the opportunity to farm in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. I've been in central Utah. Of course, I grew up in southern Idaho. And the Columbia Basin is it's got a unique blend of a long growing season, incredibly high quality and reliable water, and then we're a northern the climate we have well I'm sorry I said that all long growing season, great soil and reliable water that makes us incredibly productive. And just to a few anecdotes that often surprise people, we grow significantly more potatoes per acre than the state of Idaho. We Washington State, because of the Columbia Basin, is actually the highest average corn yields in the United States, higher than Illinois and Indiana and those Iowa, those states that we often associate with those crops. And so it isn't just that, yeah, there's farmers all throughout the nation, and we're all, obviously all farming is important and contributes, but I want to make sure everyone realizes how incredible of a region that the Columbia Basin is, and how unique. We're growing more things that you'll actually see on your plate than any other state besides California.
And so, that brings up another question that I have, which is um, for that region. Obviously, there's some pretty significant things that are working in your favor in order to be able to accomplish that. What maybe are some of the specific benefits to farming in that area? And then also, at the same time, are there any drawbacks as well to agriculture in the Southwest Washington area?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Austin, and a couple of things that initially come to mind, right? And obviously in Eastern Washington, um, some people say when you tell them you live in Washington, they think, oh, you love the green and the trees. Well, that's not the part of Washington I live in. I live in the part where we have lots of tumbleweeds and cheatgrass. So without irrigation, we are not a very productive agriculture area. Very little would grow, and you can see that if you drive through whatever. If it's the area between the pivots, there's not much growing there. Whereas the spot where the pivots are is of course incredibly productive. And so a couple things. We're a very sandy soil, which makes root crops like potatoes, onions, carrots work really well, because you can harvest the crop and get it separated from the dirt easier than if you're in a heavier soil. Um, some would, so a lot of people don't realize. In fact, we're going to talk about the dams and stuff as our conversation goes on, but um, Dam Nation, the show where they talk about dams, and there's a part in there where they're rowing down the Snake River, and the the main narrator makes a comment about all this unsustainable farming, and that comment just really makes me bristle, and so I can't resist, making this point. Is irrigated farming unsustainable, right? And if you look at it, and you look at the Midwest, and even up in the Palouse part of Washington, there's areas in our country where you get enough consistent rainfall that you can grow a crop without irrigation. But if you look at, again, the crops, the things that end up on your plate, very few of those are grown without irrigation. And there's some very specific reasons for that. One is when you can control the water, you are much more predictable. No matter how rainy a place is, they grow through drought periods, they grow through times that they don't get a good amount of water, or they get incredible amounts of water, which is also not good for crops when you get too much of a good thing. And so when we talk about sustainability, having irrigation, reliable water that you can apply on the crops as they need it, proper timing and everything, is very important for potatoes, for carrots, for onions, for so many of these crops that we're growing in the Northwest. And so it's a disadvantage that we don't have the rain. It's a great advantage too, though. And one other point on that, most places that are very rainy have a lot of humidity. Humidity is more susceptible to fungal diseases. And so you take a potato or a tomato plant, when they're in a humid place, they have a lot more plant health problems. In our dry, arid environment, our plants will be able to be significantly more productive because they aren't fighting off some of those things, which is another advantage of the basin.
Well, there may be some redundancy in where we're headed next, but it does kind of lead us right back to that opening question, which is where agriculture in Washington intersects with hydroelectricity and with our dams. And so maybe you can touch on how the controlling of water plays into that.
So because I need to irrigate, I've got to lift water out of the river and get it up to my fields. And the way I do that is with pumps that are run by electricity. So I'm a big electricity user, as well as all my neighbors and other farmers that need to get water onto the fields. And so the Northwest and its incredible renewable energy, clean power resources have been part of what has made this region what it is. If you go to Grand Coulee Dam, kind of the the biggest dam that we have on our river system, it was originally built for agriculture. Uh, they found out quickly that, wow, this energy is really good too, and that has ended up being the even bigger economic driver. But a good share of our Columbia Basin irrigated ag is because of the Grand Coulee project and the associated irrigation projects with that. And so power is very important to us, affordable power that we can get the water to our crops.
And so within that as well, many of our members at Northwest River Partners are public power members, and they serve, many of them serve Southeast Washington. I mean, we have members across the Northwest, but we do have some really strong ties over in kind of that same region that we're talking about today. So for Agri Northwest and the community that you serve, do you have any kind of good relationship going on with some of the PUDs and co-ops over in your area?
Absolutely. Awesome. You've had Rick Dunn on. Benton PUD is a great partner. Columbia REA out in Walla Walla is a great partner. So uh, definitely lots of dependency and again incredible people in those organizations that understand agriculture. We're a fickle power customer in the sense that we don't need much in the winter and we need a whole bunch in the middle of the summer, and so that creates some challenges in what they do, but they're great with working with us and finding solutions so that when we need water, it's there, it works.
Definitely. One of the things, 'cause as you mentioned, I had Rick Dunn on from Benton PUD, and we discussed a lot about grid reliability. And during that discussion, we stumbled upon something that I don't think he or I had ever really put a lot of thought or put a lot of discussion into, and I haven't really seen anywhere else. And that was the topic of how a potential blackout situation, if you had, a particularly high risk for blackouts, could be disruptive to agriculture. And, as and a lot of people know, notably, blackouts are most likely during extreme weather events like you would get during an already hot summer when you end up with a heat wave. So I do have to ask from your point of view, what might a blackout look like for a farm over in that region?
Yeah, this is a really important question. The A lot of the things that we can talk about today, and I've got lots of statistics and stuff that we may or may not get to, but are just talking about the 50,000 acres behind Ice Harbor Dam that are directly affected by the lower Snake River dams. But when we talk about power and power reliability, the the impact is much, much larger. I mean, there's about 1.4 million acres of irrigated farmland in the Columbia Basin, all of which are depending on power, to make it work. And so I'll tell you a real story of just 2 years ago we had the big heat dome event that was hard to forget. We were 116 to 118 degrees for 3 straight days. And as you can imagine, the water use by the plants during that period was extremely high. We were pumping, just trying to keep the plants going. We were pumping all the water that we could. And I think you and Rick actually talked about this a little bit. Became some issues that we actually got a call that said we might have to shut you off as we got into that late afternoon. Everybody coming home from work, turning up the AC, surge in power, and we get it, right? We're lower on the totem pole. They're going to keep the people alive, and we're going to get shut off faster because they can get a big amount of power. But that would be devastating on the crops. And I'll give a quick example in that. Luckily, that didn't happen. So I didn't have to experience this on the full farm, but I have a pivot. It was in potatoes that during that period of time, it had a mechanical problem. One of these uh, faults that it took a little bit longer to figure out what was wrong and to get it going again. And so it was off for about 8 hours during that 3 day period of time. And you could visibly see those plants were in extreme stress. Literally, you could see burning on the edges of the leaves, and that field yielded about 20% less than the other fields that we were able to keep the water going on. And so, that's a small antidote, but I think it shows if you can't depend on the power working, on the being able to pump that water through the summer, the productivity of the Columbia Basin could severely be compromised. It's a really scary thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll share quickly one of my own anecdotes. Um, it's been a kind of a family tradition that I picked back up. It kind of fell off a little bit, and then I picked it back up in recent years, which is to go out into the mountains here in the Northwest and collect huckleberries and make jam every year. And I remember that year specifically, you went up there, and the majority of the plants in August, they had kind of recovered, but the berry output was terrible, and the ones that were there, it looked like there was dried fruit hanging from the plants almost everywhere you looked, especially the ones that were more in the sun as opposed to in the shade. So, the impact of maybe just a few days of really high heat can end up, having a drastic effect months down the road. And that's something I wanted to touch on with you and, maybe ask you to clarify for people who would be listening to this and don't quite understand how that process works or what the impact really can be in that scenario, which is, if you did have the worst case scenario, right, and you lost power there, and like with the potato example you provided, in the middle of summer, you don't pick back up and start over and get to produce those crops. I mean, it's a basically really a process of months or, almost the entire year in order to get something. So if you lose it, it's just gone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the jokes that we are, between our farmers here that we talk about is we start in the spring. We're out planting potatoes right now, and we're about to start planting corn. And we say we have 60 tons of potential that we could grow right now when we start off fresh. And throughout the year, between either our own mistakes or Mother Nature's curveballs, we just keep reducing that down to whatever we end up with in the end. And so, um, in we work in year-long production cycles. What I do here in April, May, June, all keeps going. You mess it up at any point in time, and yeah, you don't recover it. There's no redo. There's no reset button. I teach my kids. We've got a little garden, so anybody who's gardened can probably relate to this. If you neglect it for a week, you go on vacation and the water quit working, or something else happens, uh you're toast for that year, and you don't get to come back. And that is a very real thing that we're dealing with as farmers. And so if you took intermittent stress on plants reduces yield, reduces quality, reduces productivity. And so that's my job as a farmer, is how can I reduce stress the most. And there's sometimes when the wind's blowing, there's not much I can do. If a hailstorm comes, there's not much I can do, but I can keep the water there. I can keep diseases away. I can keep insects away, and those things keep that plant going to ultimately produce in a way that feeds us all.
For sure. And it's funny because, we've done some survey work over the years and we've talked to people out in the public and various things. And occasionally you'll hear people say, oh, well, um, I'm comfortable with having a blackout. I'm comfortable with us not having energy for, you know, a period of a few hours or maybe, over the course of a few days because, ultimately, they'll grab some blankets if it's cold, or they'll, get some cold water if it's hot, or go off to the river or the lake, or, do whatever they're going to do. But that doesn't necessarily look the same when they go to the store in a few weeks or a few months down the road, and suddenly the shelves are looking a little bit bare. And as we saw through the last few years with the pandemic situation, people don't particularly respond well to that. So it's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and if you know there's so many of these things that uh you have to step back. If and I think it's a frustration of all these important issues, that we get narrowly focused on a single thing, when in reality, a quote I like to use a lot, um, Andy McGuire, who's a Washington State University Extension agronomist that's really great here in the basin. He talks about, in biology, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And that really applies to a lot of issues on the farm, and as we talk about the river system, and all the things that we're doing, the trade-offs of, yeah, I'm okay for an hour for a day without my air conditioning. Well, it's a bigger deal than that. And you're right. 4 months later, you will notice.
Definitely. So, as we discuss all of this, obviously we have to bring up the conversation that is breaching the lower Snake River dams, which is where a lot of, grid reliability concerns and blackout concerns for the region get brought up. Um, and maybe, you could share your perspective on what concerns you see with the removal of those dams from whether it's the transportation for the crops or the irrigation or the energy shortage side of it. I mean, I know there's a number of sort of different ways that impacts you.
It does. And the energy part of it, you've had some great guests that are explaining that well. And that's not my expertise. And so, you know, it the energy matters. And I'll just give a couple of quick, links, I guess, of how that directly affects us. So I have a pump station on the Snake River that is pumping out of Lake Sacagawea behind Ice Harbor Dam. And my neighbors have similar structures. If the Ice Harbor Dam is removed or breached in any way, obviously the water level drops 80 to 100 feet, depending on which study you look at. So just in a practical basis, now my pumps will be sitting on dry ground. And you've got to figure out a way to get the water from the new river channel up to those pumps. And we'll talk about a few different ways that that's a challenge, but the first one is that additional lift is perpetual. So that is going to take more energy. That is a reality. You're going to be lifting the water more, and you're going to have to build another pump structure down in the river to do that. And I wish I could show a picture of the structure. This is not a small thing. To irrigate 50,000 acres, it's a lot of pumps, it's a lot of concrete, it's a lot of big infrastructure. So that physical lift and the energy part of it matters, and the affordability of those things, reliability, as we've been talking about, really matters, obviously, to the farm. The second big challenge that I like to point out to people, and if you get online, you can see some of the pictures of the drawdown in 1992 when they lowered Little Goose, I think it was, and you see all the silt behind these dams is a bunch of silt. And so this river channel is not the same as it was when that dam was built. And if you look at there's other places where dams have been removed. The Elwha River is one that you can find media reports on. Even 5 years later, they're talking about the channel is still reforming and it's moving. And so my irrigation season goes from sometime in March until the end of October. So it's a relatively, long growing season in the Columbia Basin. So it's a relatively short amount of time that I don't need irrigation water. And again, my neighbors, some of which are growing apples and vineyards, long-term crops. So if it was removed, how do you get this infrastructure built in a 3 or 4 month period of time in a riverbed that is not stable? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. In fact, something on an encouraging note, I saw yesterday in a review of some of the budget proposals in Washington State. They're acknowledging that challenge and actually putting some money to try to study for answers for that, because it may be years, certainly 1 or 2 years before that channel is stable enough that you can get pumps down there again. And for me as an annual crop person, that's devastating. But when you compare that to my neighbors, I don't have much complaint. Apple orchards, cherry orchards, vineyards, they're dead. They lose everything and are starting over if you do, once you do get some things back. So those are two, anyway, to start with, two really big impacts.
Well, it it kind of makes me appreciate the discussion that we just had prior as well, because a lot of the discussion around this is that if you're going to go through with removal, then one of the solutions to some of the problems that you're bringing up, at least the proposed solutions, is we'll make everyone whole. And by making everyone whole, we'll provide them with, money to compensate for potential losses and impacts of removal. But I don't know how you compensate for the lack of production. Um, because, as you mentioned, like Washington producing more potatoes than Idaho. What, and I don't know, this might be more of a rhetorical question than anything else, but what do we do if we can't produce all of those crops and they're just erased from the marketplace?
Yeah, and I've thought a lot about this because I want to be fair to both sides, and in looking at this issue, uh, I do appreciate many, and I consider them friends that see these issues different than I do. Um, so I this is this is some ways that I put that, and I hope the war in Ukraine maybe gave us a little window here of how one production system is a can honestly affect the whole world. When they couldn't get the wheat and some other crops out of Ukraine for a time, and how really, I mean, that's why it's affecting the price all of us are paying here in the United States. For most of us in the United States, that's an inconvenience. Unfortunately, for a lot of the rest of the world, it's life or death. It's significantly impacting their ability to get enough food to feed the people in some nations. So some people might, sometimes, oh, it's only 50,000 acres behind the Snake River Dam. That's not that much in world agriculture. Well, a couple of quick statistics. Uh, we grow enough sweet corn behind just in the 50,000 acres out of Lake Sacagawea to feed 19 million people. We grow enough apples in the area behind Lake Sacagawea to feed 18 million people. We grow enough potatoes to feed over 7 million people for a year. And so you don't take those things out of the system without it does matter materially to the amount of food. And then when you bring it back to our local community, obviously it would be really devastating to those of us whose farms would be affected, and if you can't produce for a while, or lose your orchards and whatnot. But when you consider the ripple effect that those products have through our community, so obviously you've got the farmers that are and the workers that are working directly on the farms, which we're talking about over 5,000 people with just direct employment on the farms. But then we take all those products. If anybody's driven through Pasco, you get out there on the east side of town, and there's multiple sweet corn processors. There's Reeser, there's Lamb Weston, there's a lot of plants there. And so most of our product is coming in and being put in a freezer bag, or is the majority into so incredible amount of jobs around processing that food and getting it ready for the consumer. And then of course all the transportation, and many of our products are ending up on a boat and going to Asia. And so we're a tremendous exporter to the world of agriculture products. And so it's very real, and is and much farther beyond just the farms, in my view.
And, just to connect some dots for repeat listeners of this podcast, people who have listened to our previous episodes, one of the things that Rick Dunn specifically touched on was that access to energy is directly tied to how well communities or countries are able to prosper as a whole. You know, the differences between, say, the first world and the third world. Um, and then when you look at what we're discussing today, sort of the next best thing is, well, if you don't have access to that clean to the energy, and if you don't have the ability to then, produce the food you need because you don't have that, then the next best thing is to get it from someone like us who is able to produce that and then, ship it and transport it and sell it to those other places of the world. So um, it's, certainly not a good situation if you look at places that now don't have the the option to buy it and they don't have the option to grow it. Um, but aside from that kind of offshoot tangent, one of the things that I really wanted to touch on today is that you were included as one of the stakeholders who has spoken on, say, Governor Inslee's Lower Snake River Dam replacement discussion in 2020, and one of the reasons that both Kurt and I were really excited to get to have a discussion with you on the podcast is because we were so impressed by your presentation and some of the points that you've shared. So, are there some specific highlights from that maybe you could share with our audience today, and some specific things that you could take us through?
Well, I have, it's one of these things I got in this to be a farmer, not uh, not an advocate, and that's still my prayer. But these things matter, and you learn, if you don't get involved, then you don't, your view isn't presented. And so, a couple of things that I like to share that I hope people will think about. And before I say this, I want to make a comment. I have I have been on a few different things, and I got a question one time when I was on a podcast with American Rivers, and somebody said, "So do you care about salmon?" Um, and that kind of took me off guard, to be honest. But when I step back, I can understand that. From their point of view, if I was trying to advocate for, hey, these dams should stay put, maybe I didn't care about salmon, and I want to assure everyone that's absolutely not how I look at it. I believe we can have healthy rivers and a healthy economy. To my friend Alex McGregor, I'm stealing that line from him, but this works together, and one of the big pieces that I just frankly see differently than my friends that feel like breaching is the answer. I work in a biological system, trying to get potato plants to grow. We've talked about it. One of my mentors in this industry said, "You're playing chess with a potato." And we as humans want to say, if I do A, B will happen. And that's simply not the reality in a biological system. I think the world at large got a little bit of lesson on this through the COVID pandemic. I mean, there's lots of opinions about what was done right and what was done wrong through that, and I certainly have my own. But what I would point out to everyone is that virus didn't care what we were doing. What we thought was going to happen was seldom what ended up happening, regardless of how well-intentioned and how smart the people who were trying to control it were. And that is how it works in biology. That's how it works in farming. I think I've got it figured out. And boy, do I get humbled almost every year when I found out, yeah, that didn't work quite as good as you thought it would. And so when we point and say, if we took these 4 dams out, the problem is solved, salmon runs returned. I just fundamentally don't believe that. If that was the case, this would be a different discussion. But there is just way too many things, in my view, that point to a biological system that involves hundreds of miles of river, fishing impacts, urban impacts, and then the great unknown, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, but the ocean, that is where they spend most of their life. Um, and to boil that all in and say, yep, these if these four dams weren't there, we did it would all be fixed. I I just find that a naive view, because it doesn't respect the realities of biological systems, where it's just too many. There's too many factors involved here to point at just one.
I think that that's a really important point to be made, and um, I I certainly would have to agree with you as well. Um, it's interesting to see this sort of topic be looked at as a very black and white topic. It's I would describe it as very high contrast, and it would be ideal if we could discuss, maybe the subject of salmon recovery, of managing the hydro system, of balancing those two priorities, and maybe a more low contrast setting where, things aren't such extremes, right? But it is treated as though it's the silver bullet to salmon recovery in the Northwest, and it is kind of funny to think about that, just in terms of how many different river systems, like you brought up the Elwha, for example. If we breach the lower Snake River dams, we certainly don't do anything for the fish that return to that river or any of the other neighboring rivers, right? So yeah, it's you know there is like the advocacy component of it, the side of it of being in one lane or the other, but there's also just sort of the realities of it as well. And I think that it's fair to discuss those, and um, it just, like I said, it kind of comes back to that. There's the people that are on the extremes, right, and then there's sort of the middle of, well, what is the reality of the situation. And one thing we've talked a lot about on this podcast as a whole is um, the comparison between the known impacts of dam breaching and then the unknown impacts of how it may or may not play out in that biological system.
Yeah, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I just think it's worth reiterating. In biological systems, there are not solutions; there are trade-offs. And so to me, as we look at this, and again, I appreciate there are people on both sides of this issue, and that panel I was on, you mentioned, with Governor Inslee's first study, I believe there was a lot of people who were trying to look at, okay, what are the trade-offs here? If you look at the EIS, um, you know, I think those documents get dismissed way too quickly. Yeah, the environmentalist groups in a big document found one or two, found a couple things to sue on and get a stay, and we act like the whole document's garbage because of that. There's some good work in that talks about the trade-offs, and that's really what we've got to decide, in my view, as a group, is what trade-offs are worth it. Yeah, a story I've started to tell. I have 8 kids. I have a big family, and as you can imagine, with 8 kids, disagreements happen, and exciting moments happen, and often the child that's ultimately gets in trouble is quick in their explanation to start talking about all the bad things that one of the other children did. And my comment back to that is always, bad behavior does not justify bad behavior. And and as I was thinking about it a few weeks ago, I thought, I think there's some application of what's happening there, again, because that's human nature, right? We think, hey, I was mistreated, I'm okay mistreating others. And you look at the history of all that's happened, in the Northwest with rivers, and there is some not good things that happened. 100% agree. Um, when we look at fishing, when we look at the tribes, when we look at, if we could go back and change some of those decisions, I think all of us would. But sometimes it feels like, hey, because that bad behavior happened, let's do something now that would be very harmful to a lot of other people that had nothing to do with that, those things that happened in the past. And so I just hope that the crowd that looks at it that way is minimized, and those that want to look at the whole and the trade-offs are are able to carry the dialogue.
Certainly, and there is a lot of working together that needs to be done on a lot of different areas of, not just salmon or energy or any of that, but just, the entire region and our goals as a whole. And within that too, there's also, I think, a discussion that's worth having about the climate policies that have implications not just for our space and energy, but also for farming. And, at the same time that we're discussing things like dam removal and the potential impacts of that, we're also making some other big changes and shifts that, have implications both negative and positive, and or just require change to take place. So from the agriculture side of things, what are some of the issues that you're working through in terms of sustainability and carbon footprint and things like that, and what challenges and opportunities do those policies present?
Yeah, that's there. Boy, there's a lot to that question. So let me hit on a first couple things that come to mind and see if it gets there. So one of the first things that I like to remind people, I grow a lot of plants, and the number one food for plants is CO2. Um, Living things are the best users that we have of CO2, specifically the plant. We're putting out the CO2, and they're taking it back in. And so um, when we think about carbon solutions, let's not forget the plants. Um, when we look at and this is something that I try to communicate whenever I get the opportunity. We've talked about how important grid reliability is to us. Our state is very focused on reducing carbon. That is where our political leaders are, and have put some very aggressive policies into place along those lines. If you're going to do those things, then you need clean energy. We've got to keep the clean energy part of it. And so again, stepping back and making sure we're thinking about do we have the solution for keeping the power going as we try to transition from fossil fuels to more electrification, but then, on another front, talk about removing a renewable, clean source of energy. And we look at our friends in California, we look at Texas, both have recently went through times where they've found out in painful ways that they went too fast. They weren't ready, and that had devastating consequences on their states and on an individual lives. So I hope as a state we can keep those two things balanced, because as we've talked about, it could be devastating for agriculture. The other first thing that comes to mind is when you look at, again, food production. A lot of California, a lot of people don't realize this. California is the number one agriculture state in the United States. There's a lot of agriculture in California. But as we're seeing, this year they're having a great snowpack, and hopefully their drought woes are certainly going to be better this year. But the reality of California is water scarcity is driving many crops to the Northwest. I'm now growing carrots that used to be grown in California. I'm now growing onions on my farm that used to be grown in California. And so having a place with reliable water that can produce these products and be a replacement for some areas of the country that are having challenges that I'm not sure that there's a long-term answer to, is a really important thing, I think, for the whole world.
You know, in discussing this, it sort of makes me think that as we talk about the biological systems of the crops you grow, and we think about the biological systems of the salmon, whether it's the CO2 component or the the crop component, um, the farms that are in question, you know, the farms that you work on are really part of our biological system. And so, you know, there's something to be said for ensuring that that part of our biological system doesn't experience some, you know, hiccups or changes that could, you know, disrupt what we've come to know and rely on.
And we understand biological systems are fragile, um, whether it's our human body or the the salmon's runs, the agriculture, you know, like any of them can be greatly impacted by things that happen. And so, you know, it's fragile systems. We have to be careful and be deliberate.
Yeah, I think it's easy in a modern world to maybe forget that we are just as much at the will of that as anything else around us. So it's a good important reminder. You know, we're really I think we're you know we've covered a lot today, and we've had a lot of good discussion and covered a lot of topics. Are there any messages that you particularly want to make sure to leave with our listeners after this episode of the podcast? Anything that you know, any key takeaways from today's discussion that you hope people will have?
Um, you know, I certainly don't claim to have all the answers. I hope I've represented well some of the challenges that are a reality for irrigated agriculture and hopefully shown um, you know, some importance. It's that it is things that matter. And you know, in this political environment that our nation's in right now, where um, we very much get pushed in, you know, we try to get pushed into separate corners and things. Um, I just, to me, the chance to listen to other people and understand their point of view changes yours, and it certainly has for me on this issue as I talk to others and listen to their point of view. Again, I still have my opinions, but I find out, hey, well, there's some things that I didn't realize and that I didn't understand, and anyway, hopefully people are willing to listen to my side and my perspective and I feel like some have, and that helps. Versus what unfortunately happens sometimes is they find a political ally and find a way to subvert the system and get their way, and it becomes a win. I've got to win and you're going to lose. And I just ultimately don't think it has to be that way.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really important note, particularly in this discussion, that you know no matter where you do line up, we need to ultimately find a way to work through it together, and that does really tie into kind of where we always conclude on this podcast. So I know that you brought up some of our other guests. Have you listened to some other episodes of Damn before?
I have. I listened to all your episodes. I
All
was
right,
trying to
so
prepare, Austin. I didn't know what you'd have for me.
you know what's coming then. So, do you have any good advice that you want to leave our listeners with at the end of this one? Maybe it's about listening, but it could be about anything really.
My children are all rolling their eyes right now, Austin. Why would you ask him for advice? um, you know, I guess what I would say on I have a scripture that I put on the bottom of all my emails, and it says, "Oh, be wise. What more can I say?" And obviously, wisdom, you know, that can mean a lot of things, but But to me, it comes back to, again, um, uh, some of the things that I already mentioned, in the sense of we we can decide to not, we got to have a win-lose environment. And I'm competitive, and I can get in that mindset myself for sure. But when we're dealing with each other, most of the time that's not the reality. And so when we step back, look at the big picture, look at the trade-offs, and really, are able to weigh that out, we often find ways that we can both win. And that's the way I try to live my life. Let's find ways that we all win.
That's great. That really is. And I think that whether that applies to what we talked about today or really anything else, that's a pretty good approach to take. So I appreciate it. And I really appreciate your time today. This has been a really insightful discussion. And just thinking back on it already, the amount of ground that we were able to cover during this and the different things we were able to touch on, I think it's going to be a real wealth of information for our listeners. And you're our first agricultural guest as well, so I really hope that we set the stage pretty well, and I think the bar has also been set really high on this. So really appreciate your time.
I appreciate the conversation, and yeah, hopefully you've had a lot of smart people on. I hope I don't bring it down.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think you've only brought it up more and really added something to it that we desperately needed, and I'm really excited that we have. So yeah, thank you sincerely for being on today.
Thanks, Austin.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Damn as much as I enjoyed recording it. We were able to cover a lot of ground during that time, and the kind of knowledge and insight that Blaine was able to share with us today are the product of the lifetime he spent in farming, and really can only be gained through a lifetime spent in farming. It's exactly the kind of knowledge and insight that we want to share with the world through this podcast. So it's always a good day when I can confidently say, hey, we achieved exactly that, when we wrap up and shut off the mics. And there's a lot more of that knowledge and insight headed your way in the upcoming episodes we're cooking up here at River Partners HQ. If you didn't know, that's your hint to subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening on right now, so you don't miss out on future releases, which arrive every other Friday. Not only that, we want to hear what knowledge and insight you received from today's podcast. You can do that by leaving us a review on the same listening platform, and your positive reviews are essential to helping us grow and expand our audience. Now, if you're all caught up on episodes of Damn and you just can't satisfy your craving for more hydropower in your life, you can always find us on social media at NW River Partners, and you can head to our website, nwriverpartners.org. Until next time, see ya!